Okay. And hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may happen to be. It is currently 1 o'clock in the morning here in California. I'm Tad. I will be here for about the next hour. I will be reading. Most of you already know that. No surprises there. And let me think. Anything else in particular to talk to you? Well, the big news, as it were, the news of the week is that my beloved has returned from overseas, from the wilds of the West Midlands and various sojourns into the dark heart of undiscovered Yorkshire, uh, Lancashire, all round about them foreign parts, and some time in London too to see some friends there. So she is back. We are all relieved, happy, excited even. The For once, and I can say this because usually Deb's mom pops in oftentimes to say hello, and usually I have to tell her that her daughter is upstairs asleep. Her daughter is upstairs tonight, but she is not asleep because she is riding the roller coaster of jet lag. So she has been sleeping much of the day today, and she is now awake again, or at least she was the last time I looked. So, but other than that, not much to actually check in about or talk about in the sense of anything new or exciting. She's back. She had a good time. That's what matters. We all missed her, and now we don't have to miss her anymore. She is, as I said, it's a bit floundering through jet lag a bit, as we all do when we get back from a transcontinental trip. There's always a great deal of debate about whether it's worse going west or going east. You know, if it's bad, if it's worse coming from America and going to Europe and the jet lag you get there, or back the other way around. I don't remember. It all fuzzes out for me. Although certainly it's nicer to be jet lagged at home when you don't have schedules and people you're supposed to see and things you're supposed to do while maintaining some kind of normal human attitude. So, fortunately for Deb, she is home now and can snooze when she needs to, which is a good thing. Dogs are doing okay. Lemon is basically has just attached herself to Deborah and the bed and is happily ensconced. She goes from either being a very wild, excitable dog who loves to play and run around and all that, and then as soon as people are in bed, she's in there too, and then we'll just stay there for hours, which is one of the things I've heard about pit bull type dogs, Staffordshire Terriers, whatever you want to call them. And that certainly is true for Lemon. Johnny is his normal Johnny self, grumpy, sore, cranky, as I frequently point out, much like me. And so that is all good. The book is now out of my hands in terms of The Splintered Sun. It has been copy edited and gone back. I am currently working on the next book, which I will tell you about when I have a better handle on it. Because right now I'm playing that. Well, then this could happen, but maybe what if this happens instead? And so everything is just completely liquid, for lack of a better word. Everything just flows around, and I keep trying different things and seeing what feels good. And something may feel good for a little while, but then as I think on it more, I kind of push it aside, try something different. So I'm very much in that mode, which is a great deal of fun for a writer because you haven't committed to anything yet. You're not already in the following in your own tracks, as it were, but things are still very much up in the air, which I'm enjoying. But it also is a different kind of work too, so have to find time to really kind of sink into the whole process. What else? Well, we are reading tonight, when I start reading in a few minutes or so, from specifically from Through the Looking Glass, the second Alice in Wonderland book that Lewis Carroll wrote, otherwise known as the Reverend Charles Dodgson. The edition I'm reading from, however, is the annotated Alice, which is with notes and annotations yeah, by Martin Gardner, who I talked about a little bit last week, and what a fascinating guy he was. A mathematician, a lover of stage magic, fascinated by puzzles and mathematical tricks and things like that. He wrote a column for Scientific American on scientific and mathematical puzzles for many years, interested in all different kinds of things. Really interesting guy, just in and of himself. And among other things, he was also a bit of a Lewis Carroll scholar. And so I think I'll actually probably be reading a couple of his notes tonight, specifically because we're talking about some of the main concepts and some of the things also, and the reason I started reading this in the first place was because it was such a big influence on me in a number of ways back from childhood, because I remember first reading this in childhood and being particularly struck by, but particularly struck by one of the sections that I think we're going to read tonight, which was the sheep in a shop section, for lack of a better name for it, which is honestly, in terms of the whole story, it's not super important. But for some reason, there was something in the dreamlike, extremely dreamlike quality of it, as opposed to, say, in many other places where Lewis Carroll is playing with puns and jokes and bits of logic and pointing a mocking finger at a lot of current philosophy of his time, which of course was Victorian. And, just generally, poking fun at things and making fun of schools and how children are taught and all that kind of stuff. Whereas a lot of the parts that affected me the most deeply are the really dreamlike portions of the text. And I will talk a little bit about that tonight, because that's definitely some of the stuff that showed up in the Otherland books for me, and as an influence probably showed up in a lot of other places as well. So anyway, before I do that, though, let's check in and see who has left messages or anything like that there. And hang on, I want that one there. Okay, so we have Christy Sanders checking in. Hello, good morning. Isaac Tim checking in as well from the Valley. Hello. Alexandra Lirip checking in from the Netherlands. Penny Davies, hello, good to see you. Suzanne Owen, who is saying hello from Yorkshire and being harassed by an annoying cat. I totally get where you're coming from on that one. Chris Fobb is checking in from Denmark. Aha! Oh, so you're up in Denmark again. Lovely. We actually, when we were in Denmark, we got to see Chris because he goes up there frequently. Nicole, hello. Good to see you too. That's Nicole Grass. Sandra Theis, hello. Sandra greets us from her tiny wine village. Mr. Mark Craigbaum asks for, or says it's time for 6 impossible things. And yes, I believe that section comes up tonight too, depending on how far we get. Nikki Chetwynd, as always, saying hello from bright and sunny Leicestershire, which is nice to hear. And yes, Suzanne points out I am back downstairs. Yes, I am, because I figured Deb might want to have her table back, which was where I was doing everything before. And Deborah needs a lot of surface space for all of her projects upstairs. So I have removed myself back down to where the cats hang out. Mr. Mark Redman checks in from a gloriously sunny Yorkshire, although with a slight chill. Maria Jose shows up to say hello, Tad and friends. Christina Spire shows up. Never read the Alice books, only know the movies. Exciting. Well, cool. I hope you'll enjoy it. They're actually quite amazing books. There's a reason that they have stayed English language classics. I'd be interested to know how well known they are in other parts of Europe, but in the English language, certainly they are considered I think justifiably so, to be classics of children's literature. In part because they're so damn weird, but that's another subject that we're going to get to in a moment. Rosalba checks in to say hello and good morning. Hello, hello. Chenoa checks in to say hello, hi all. And Dirk, who also checks in to say hello to all the folks and that he is glad to be here. And we are glad to have you with us, as always. It's always a pleasure. Let me think if there's anything else that I wanted to mention. No, it's just been like 9 kinds of polite hell the last week, just because there's so many things to do, so many things still to be taken care of that, some of this stuff was put off before my trips to Denmark and Germany back in the fall, and is now all coming due. Plus lots of other stuff that got put on hold while Deborah was in England. And is coming due in a sense right now. So it's just been a super busy last week or so since Deb came back, and even before that. So not much to report except the minutia of just daily boring life, having to deal with doctors, veterinarians, the DMV, you name it, insurance, this, that, everything all came flooding in with crises all at the same time. Stolen identity, you name it. That happens to us like every couple of weeks, which is something that poor Deb has often had to deal with. So not much to tell in any real sense of the word, in the sense of anything that would be what I would consider interesting. I don't think you really want to hear about my battles with the DMV AI. DMVAI. There's 5 letters to put a chill on your heart. And indeed, I had a dramatic day trying to deal with them the other day, just to get my driver's license renewed, and it was just absolutely mind-bending. I'm sure there was some flaw that occurred either because of me or because of the AI itself in the process, but I just got stuck in this endless loop that literally I had to input the same information like 8 or 9 or 10 times, and finally had a breakthrough where I actually got to where I wanted to be. But once you've put the same long list of different things that they want to know in for like the 7th or 8th or 9th time, that's probably as close to being murderous as I ever get, and of course I'm dealing with no human beings at all, so there's not even anybody I can fantasize about killing. It is very difficult to fantasize in any useful way about killing an AI questionnaire. It just doesn't give that satisfaction. Anyway, so what I am going to do now, without further ado, I think, is I'm going to start reading because I like reading, and because that's what I'm doing. That's my whole excuse for being here, and presumably that's your excuse for indulging me. So, Alice, of course, has gone through the Looking Glass, establishing one of the many tropes that will run all through this book, and all of which have had their effect on me and my work as well. The mirror itself, and the idea of a looking glass world, which is in fact an inversion of the real world, not simply a dream world, although much of the action in this book is very dreamlike, but a literal inversion. And we talked about that briefly last week, where they were suggesting that something that Alice was thinking about eating and thinking that it probably wouldn't agree with her, and then Martin Gardner popped in to say, yes, actually in recent years scientists have discovered that it would be possible to have these reversed, essentially mirror versions of things that we already know. But if you ate, like, say, for instance, mirror food, because all the molecules would be flipped the wrong way around, it actually would not be very good for you at all. So anyway, so she has just met up with the Red Queen. There's also, so there's many, many different levels that are going on here. There is the mirror level, which comes up from time to time. There is the idea of the chess game, which this next bit will actually talk about a little bit. I started it last week and then decided to end there and come back to it this week. So the chess game, because this is actually a chess match, of sorts going on. And the Red Queen has just told Alice that if she goes to the ending, that she too will become a queen, which is what happens, of course, when a pawn reaches the end of the chessboard. The pawn can then be exchanged for another piece, which is usually a queen because they are the most powerful of all the pieces. It's also interesting, and we will talk about the Red King dreaming in a moment, but how much more powerful in Lewis Carroll the female characters are, and especially the queens. Now, part of that may be a sort of phantom reference to the fact that Victoria was on the throne when these books were being written, who would go on to have one of the longest reigns of any monarch. There could be other reasons, but it is interesting to me how much more powerful the female characters are in this. Anyway, so Alice is with the Red Queen, and that is what we are doing right now. And I'm going to go back about a paragraph or two to read the lead up here. Yes, I see you over there, Cat. The cat is flipping his treat box over. So, continuing with Through the Looking Glass. For some minutes, Alice stood without speaking, looking out in all directions over the country. And a most curious country it was. There were a number of tiny little brooks running straight across it from side to side, and the ground between was divided up into squares by a number of little green hedges that reached from brook to brook. No surprise that, when I used the Through the Looking Glass material to become one of the Otherland simulation worlds or sim worlds, that it was called the 8 squared, because that is in fact a chessboard 8 by 8. I declare it's marked out just like a large chessboard, Alice said at last. There ought to be some men moving about somewhere. And so there are, she added in a tone of delight, and her heart began to beat quick with excitement as she went on. It's a great, huge game of chess that's being played all over the world. If this is the world at all, Oh, what fun it is. How I wish I was one of them. I wouldn't mind being a pawn if only I might. Though, of course, I should like to be queen best. She glanced rather shyly at the real queen as she said this, but her companion only smiled pleasantly and said, That's easily managed. You can be the White Queen's pawn if you like, as Lily's too young to play. And you're in the 2nd square to begin with. When you get to the 8th square, you'll be a queen. Just at this moment, somehow or other, they began to run. Alice never could quite make out, and thinking it over afterwards, how it was that they began. All she remembers is that they were running hand in hand, and the queen went so fast that it was all she could do to keep up with her. And still the queen kept crying, Faster, faster! But Alice felt she could not go faster, though she had no breath left to say so. The most curious part of the thing was that the trees and the other things round them never changed their places at all. However fast they went, they never seemed to pass anything. I wonder if all the things move along with us, thought poor puzzled Alice. And the queen seemed to guess her thoughts, for she cried, Faster! Faster! Don't try to talk! Not that Alice had any idea of doing that. She felt as if she would never be able to talk again. She was getting so much out of breath. And still the queen cried, Faster! Faster! And dragged her along. Are we nearly there? Alice managed to pant out at last. Nearly there? The queen repeated. Why, we passed it 10 minutes ago. Faster! And they ran on for a time in silence, with the wind whistling in Alice's ears, and almost blowing her hair off her head, she fancied. Now! Now! Cried the queen. Faster! Faster! And they went so fast that at last they seemed to skim through the air, hardly touching the ground with their feet, till suddenly, just as Alice was getting quite exhausted, they stopped, and she found herself sitting on the ground, breathless and giddy. The queen propped her up against a tree and said kindly, You may rest a little now. Alice looked round her in great surprise. Why, I do believe we've been under this tree the whole time. Everything's just as it was."
"Of course it is," said the Queen. "What would you have it?"
"Well, in our country," said Alice, still panting a little, "you generally get to somewhere else. If you ran very fast for a long time, as we've been doing."
"A slow sort of country," said the Queen. "Now here, you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that."
And of course, as Martin Gardner points out in the notes, this has probably been quoted more often, usually in reference to rapidly changing political situations, than any other passage in the Alice books. "I'd rather not try, please," said Alice. "I'm quite content to stay here, only I am so hot and thirsty."
"I know what you'd like," the Queen said good-naturedly, taking a little box out of her pocket. "Have a biscuit?"
Alice thought it would not be civil to say no, although it wasn't at all what she wanted. So she took it and ate it as well as she could, and it was very dry, and she thought she had never been so nearly choked in all her life.
"While you're refreshing yourself," said the Queen, "I'll just take the measurements."
And she took a ribbon out of her pocket, marked in inches, and began measuring the ground and sticking little pegs in here and there.
"At the end of 2 yards," she said, putting in a peg to mark the distance, "I shall give you your directions. Have another biscuit?"
"No, thank you," said Alice. "One's quite enough."
"Thirst quenched, I hope," said the Queen.
Alice did not know what to say to this, but luckily the Queen did not wait for an answer, but went on.
"At the end of 3 yards I shall repeat them, for fear of your forgetting them. At the end of 4 I shall say goodbye, and at the end of 5 I shall go."
She had got all the pegs put in by this time, and Alice looked on with great interest as she returned to the tree, and then began slowly walking down the row. At the 2-yard peg she faced round and said, "A pawn goes 2 squares in its first move, you know. So you'll go very quickly through the 3rd square, by railway, I should think, and you'll find yourself in the 4th square in no time. Well, that square belongs to Tweedledum and Tweedledee. The 5th is mostly water. The 6th belongs to Humpty Dumpty. But you make no remark." I didn't know I had to make one just then," Alice faltered out. "You should have said," the Queen went on in a tone of grave reproof. "It's extremely kind of you to tell me all this. However, we'll suppose it said. The 7th square is all forest. However, one of the knights will show you the way. And in the 8th square we shall be queens together, and it's all feasting and fun." Alice got up and curtsied and sat down again. At the next peg the Queen turned again, and this time she said, "Speak in French when you can't think of the English for a thing. Turn out your toes when you walk, and remember who you are." She did not wait for Alice to curtsy this time, but walked on quickly to the next peg, where she turned round for a moment to say "Goodbye," and then hurried on to the last. How it happened, Alice never knew, but exactly as she came to the last peg, she was gone. Whether she vanished into the air, or whether she ran quickly into the wood, and she can run very fast, thought Alice. There was no way of guessing, but she was gone, and Alice began to remember that she was a pawn, and that it would soon be time for her to move. And then Martin Gardner very helpfully goes on to explain where exactly they are in the chess game of this particular section. And one of the interesting things is that you can follow it as a chess game, that the movements also are reflected in the story. Chapter 3, Looking Glass Insects. Of course, the first thing to do was to make a grand survey of the country she was going to travel through. It's something very like learning geography, thought Alice as she stood on tiptoe in hopes of being able to see a little further. Principal rivers. There are none. Principal mountains. I'm on the only one, but I don't think it's got any name. Principal towns. Why, what are those creatures making honey down there? They can't be bees. Nobody ever saw bees a mile off, you know. And for some time she stood silent, watching one of them that was bustling about among the flowers, poking its proboscis into them. Just as if it was a regular bee, thought Alice. However, this was anything but a regular bee. In fact, it was an elephant, as Alice soon found out, although the idea quite took her breath away at first. And what enormous flowers they must be, was her next idea. Something like cottages with the roofs taken off and stalks put to them. And what quantities of honey they must make. I think I'll go down. No, I won't go just yet, she went on, checking herself just as she was beginning to run down the hill and trying to find some excuse for turning shy so suddenly. It'll never do to go down among them without a good long branch to brush them away. And what fun it'll be when they ask me how I liked my walk. I shall say, "Oh, I liked it well enough." Here came the favorite little toss of the head. Only it was so dusty and hot, and the elephants did tease so. I think I'll go down the other way, she said after a pause, and perhaps I may visit the elephants later on. Besides, I do so want to get into the third square. So, with this excuse, she ran down the hill and jumped over the first of the 6 little brooks. And just to be explaining here, there are little marks in the text that show that she has crossed from one square into another. "Tickets, please," said the guard, putting his head in the window. In a moment everybody was holding out a ticket. They were about the same size as the people and quite seemed to fill the railway carriage. "Now then, show your ticket, child," the guard went on, looking angrily at Alice. And a great many voices all said together, like the chorus of a song, thought Alice, "Don't keep him waiting, child. Why, his time is worth £1,000 a minute." "I'm afraid I haven't got one," Alice said in a frightened tone. "There wasn't a ticket office where I came from." And again the chorus of voices went on, "There wasn't room for one where she came from. The land there is worth £1,000 an inch." "Don't make excuses," said the guard. "You should have brought one. You should have bought one from the engine driver." And once more the chorus of voices went on with, "The man that drives the engine. Why, the smoke alone is worth £1,000 a puff." Alice thought to herself, then there's no use in speaking. The voices didn't join in this time, as she hadn't spoken, but to her great surprise, they all thought in chorus. I hope you understand what thinking in chorus means, for I must confess that I don't. "Better say nothing at all. Language is worth £1,000 a word." "I shall dream about £1,000 tonight, I know I shall," thought Alice. All this time the guard was looking at her, first through a telescope, then through a microscope, and then through an opera glass. At last he said, "You're travelling the wrong way," and shut up the window and went away. "So young a child," said the gentleman sitting opposite to her. He was dressed in white paper. "Ought to know which way she's going, even if she doesn't know her own name." A goat that was sitting next to the gentleman in white shut his eyes and said in a loud voice, "She ought to know her way to the ticket office, even if she doesn't know her alphabet." There was a beetle sitting next to the goat. It was a very queer carriage full of passengers altogether, and as the rule seemed to be that they should all speak in turn, he went on with, "She'll have to go back from here as luggage." Anyway, here, if we can get a decent shot of it. Here is the railway carriage. There's the goat and the man in the paper hat and dressed all in white paper, and the what they called him, the guard, the attendant looking in at the window. She'll have to go back from here as luggage. Alice couldn't see who was sitting beyond the beetle, but a hoarse, H-O-A-R-S-E, voice spoke next. Change engines, it said, and there it choked and was obliged to leave off. It sounds like a horse, Alice thought to herself, and an extremely small voice close to her ear said, You might make a joke on that. Something about horse and horse, you know. Then a very gentle voice in the distance said, She must be labelled Lass, handle with care, you know. That's a pun on what they used to use in Victorian days. Instead of fragile, it would say glass, handle with care, or glass with care. And after that, other voices went on. What a number of people there are in this carriage, thought Alice, saying, She must go by post. She's got a head on her. That was slang for a stamp because it had the Queen's head on it. She must be sent as a message by the telegraph. She must draw the train herself the rest of the way, and so on. But the gentleman dressed in white paper leaned forward and whispered in her ear, Never mind what they all say, my dear, but take a return ticket every time the train stops. Indeed I shan't, Alice said rather impatiently. I don't belong to this railway journey at all. I was in a wood just now, and I wish I could get back there. You might make a joke on that, said the little voice close to her ear. Something about you would if you could, you know. Don't tease so, said Alice, looking about in vain to see where the voice came from. If you're so anxious to have a joke made, why don't you make one yourself? The little voice sighed deeply. It was very unhappy, evidently, and Alice would have said something pitying to comfort it. If it would only sigh like other people, she thought. But this was such a wonderfully small sigh that she wouldn't have heard it at all if it hadn't come quite close to her ear. The consequence of this was that it tickled her ear very much and quite took off her thoughts from the unhappiness of the poor little creature. I know you are a friend, the little voice went on, a dear friend and an old friend, and you won't hurt me though I am an insect. What kind of insect? Alice inquired a little anxiously. What she really wanted to know was whether it could sting or not, but she thought that wouldn't be a civil question to ask. What, then you don't, the little voice began, when it was drowned by a shrill scream from the engine, and everybody jumped up in alarm, Alice among the rest. The horse, who had put his head out of the window, quietly drew it in and said, It's only a brook we have to jump over. Everybody seemed satisfied with this, though Alice felt a little nervous at the idea of trains jumping at all. However, it'll take us into the fourth square, that's some comfort, she said to herself. In another moment she felt the carriage rise straight up into the air, and in her fright she caught at the thing nearest to her hand, which happened to be the goat's beard. And then we get another little set of marks to show that they've crossed into the next square. But the beard seemed to melt away as she touched it, and she found herself sitting quietly under a tree, while the gnat, for that was the insect she had been talking to, was balancing itself on a twig just over her head and fanning her with its wings. It certainly was a very large gnat, about the size of a chicken, Alice thought. Still, she couldn't feel nervous with it after they had been talking together so long. Then you don't like all insects, the gnat went on quietly as if nothing had happened. I like them when they can talk, Alice said. None of them ever talk where I come from. What sort of insects do you rejoice in where you come from? The gnat inquired. I don't rejoice in insects at all,
Alice explained. Because I'm rather afraid of them, at least the large kinds, but I can tell you the names of some of them. Of course they answer to their names, the gnat remarked carelessly. I never knew them to do it. What's the use of their having names, the gnat said, if they won't answer to them? No use to them, said Alice, but it's useful to the people that name them, I suppose. If not, why do things have names at all? And interestingly enough, where is the is there a comment on that? Bum, 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 bum. Yeah, here it is. This is a couple of pages further up, because we're going to come to the wood where things have no names, but it pertains to what the gnat just said, I think, and is rather interesting. This is Martin Gardner's annotation. The wood in which things have no name is in fact the universe itself, as it is apart from some symbol manipulating creatures who label portions of it because, as Alice earlier remarked with pragmatic wisdom, it's useful to the people that name them. The realization that the world by itself contains no signs, that there is no connection whatever between things and their names except by way of a mind that finds the tags useful, is by no means a trivial philosophic insight. The fawn's delight in recalling its name, again, this hasn't happened yet, but the fawn's delight in recalling its name reminds one of the old joke about Adam naming the tiger because it looked like a tiger. Anyway, back to the story. If not, why do things have names at all? I can't say, the gnat replied. Further on in the wood down there, they've got no names. However, go on with your list of insects. You're wasting time. Well, there's the horsefly, Alice began, counting off the names on her fingers. All right, said the gnat. Halfway up that bush, you'll see a rocking horsefly. If you look, it's made entirely of wood and gets about by swinging itself from branch to branch. What does it live on? Alice asked with great curiosity. Sap and sawdust, said the gnat. Go on with the list. Alice looked at the rocking horsefly with great interest and made up her mind that it must have been just repainted. It looked so bright and sticky. And then she went on. And there's the dragonfly. Look on that branch above your head, said the gnat, and there you'll find a snapdragonfly. Its body is made of plum pudding, its wings of holly leaves, and its head is a raisin burning in brandy. And what does it live on? Alice asked as before. Frumenty and mince pie, the gnat replies, and it makes its nest in a Christmas box. So, the reference here, now some of the folks out there tonight from England probably already know this, but snapdragon originally was, before it was a flower, I believe, or separately from it being a kind of flower, snapdragon was a game played at Christmas time, certainly in England, with raisins put into a shallow dish of brandy, and the brandy was lit on fire. And the players, young people, but people of all ages presumably, would try to snatch the raisins out without getting burned and then eat them while they were still hot. So that's what the snapdragon joke is about, that it has a body made of plum pudding and wings of holly leaves, and its head is a raisin burning in brandy. Frumenty, by the way, which they mention here, is a kind of pudding, a British dessert pudding, I believe. And then there's the butterfly, Alice went on after she had taken a good look at the insect with its head on fire and had thought to herself, I wonder if that's the reason insects are so fond of flying into candles, because they want to turn into snapdragon flies. Crawling at your feet, said the gnat. Alice drew her feet back in some alarm. You may observe a bread and butter fly. Its wings are thin slices of bread and butter. Its body is a crust, and its head is a lump of sugar. And what does it live on? Weak tea with cream in it. A new difficulty came into Alice's head. Supposing it couldn't find any, she suggested. Then it would die, of course. But that must happen very often, Alice remarked thoughtfully. It always happens, said the gnat. After this, Alice was silent for a minute, pondering. The gnat amused itself meanwhile by humming around and around her head. At last it settled again and remarked, I suppose you don't want to lose your name? No, indeed, Alice said a little anxiously. And yet, I don't know, the gnat went on in a careless tone. Only think how convenient it would be if you could manage to go home without it. For instance, if the governess wanted to call you to your lessons, she would call out, Come here, and then she would have to leave off because there wouldn't be any name for her to call. And of course you wouldn't have to go, you know. That would never do, I'm sure, said Alice. The governess would never think of excusing me lessons for that. If she couldn't remember my name, she'd call me Miss, as the servants do. Well, if she said Miss and didn't say anything more, the gnat remarked, of course you'd miss your lessons. That's a joke. I wish you had made it. Why do you wish I had made it? Alice asked. It's a very bad one. But the gnat only sighed deeply, while two large tears came rolling down its cheeks. You shouldn't make jokes, Alice said, if it makes you unhappy. Then came another of those melancholy little sighs. And this time the poor gnat really seemed to have sighed itself away, for when Alice looked up there was nothing whatever to be seen on the twig, and as she was getting quite chilly with sitting still so long, she got up and walked on. She very soon came to an open field with a wood on the other side of it. It looked much darker than the last wood, and Alice felt a little timid about going into it. However, on second thoughts, she made up her mind to go on. For I certainly won't go back, she thought to herself, and this was the only way to the 8th square. This must be the wood, she said thoughtfully to herself, where things have no names. I wonder what'll become of my name when I go in. I shouldn't like to lose it at all, because they'd have to give me another, and it would almost be certain to be an ugly one. But then the fun would be trying to find the creature that had got my old name. That's just like the advertisements, you know, the advertisements. When people lose dogs, answers to the name of Dash had on a brass collar. Just fancy calling everything you met Alice till one of them answered. Only they wouldn't answer at all if they were wise. She was rambling on in this way when she reached the wood. It looked very cool and shady. Well, at any rate, it's a great comfort, she said, as she stepped under the trees, after being so hot, to get into what? She went on, rather surprised at not being able to think of the word. I mean to get under this, you know, putting her hand on the trunk of the tree. What does it call itself, I wonder? I do believe it's got no name. Why, to be sure it hasn't. She stood silent for a minute, thinking. Then she suddenly began again. Then it really has happened after all. And now who am I? I will remember if I can. I'm determined to do it. But being determined didn't help her much, and all she could say, after a great deal of puzzling, was, L. I know it begins with an L. And of course, this is another little joke of Lewis Carroll's, because the true Alice, for whom the books were initially at least conceived of, and certainly one of his regular storytelling auditors, her last name was Liddell, Liddell. No, 2 L's, Liddell. So that's a little nod toward the real Alice. Just then a fawn came wandering by. It looked at Alice with its large, gentle eyes, but didn't seem at all frightened. Here then, Alice said as she held out her hand and tried to stroke it, but it only started back a little and then stood, looking at her again. "What do you call yourself?" the fawn said at last. Such a soft, sweet voice it had. "I wish I knew," thought poor Alice. She answered rather sadly, "Nothing just now." "Think again," it said. "That won't do." Alice thought, but nothing came of it. "Please, would you tell me what you call yourself?" she said timidly. "I think that might help a little." "I'll tell you if you'll come a little further on," the fawn said. "I can't remember here." So they walked on together through the wood, Alice with her arms clasped lovingly round the soft neck of the fawn, till they came out into another open field. And here the fawn gave a sudden bound into the air and shook itself free from Alice's arms. "I'm a fawn!" it cried out in a voice of delight. "And, dear me, you're a human child!" A sudden look of alarm came into its beautiful brown eyes, and in another moment it had darted away at full speed. Alice stood looking after it, almost ready to cry with vexation at having lost her dear little fellow travelers so quickly. "However, I know my name now," she said. "That's some comfort. Alice. Alice. I won't forget it again. And now, which of these finger posts ought I to follow, I wonder?" It was not a very difficult question to answer, as there was only one road through the wood, and the two finger posts both pointed along it. "I'll settle it," Alice said to herself, "when the road divides and they point different ways." But this did not seem likely to happen. She went on, she went on and on, a long way. But wherever the road divided, there were sure to be two finger posts pointing the same way, one marked "To Tweedledum's house," and the other "To the house of Tweedledee." "I do believe," said Alice at last, "that they live in the same house. I wonder I never thought of that before, but I can't stay there long. I'll just call and say, 'How d'ye do?' and ask them the way out of the wood. If I could only get to the 8th square before it gets dark." So she wandered on, talking to herself as she went, till, on turning a sharp corner, she came upon two fat little men, so suddenly that she could not help starting back, but in another moment she recovered herself, feeling sure they must be Chapter 4, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. And as Gardner points out here, the last words of the chapter, "feeling sure that they must be," and the title of the chapter coming up, "Tweedledum and Tweedledee," makes a rhyme. They were standing under a tree, each with an arm round the other's neck, and Alice knew which was which in a moment, because one of them had "Dumb" embroidered on his collar, and the other "D." "I suppose they've each got Tweedle round at the back of the collar," she said to herself. They stood so still that she quite forgot they were alive, and she was just going round to see if the word "Tweedle" was written at the back of each collar, when she was startled by a voice coming from the one marked "Dumb." "If you think we're waxworks," he said, "you ought to pay, you know. Waxworks weren't made to be looked at for nothing, nohow. Contrariwise," added the one marked "D," "if you think we're alive, you ought to speak." I'm sure I'm very sorry," was all Alice could say, for the words of the old song kept ringing through her head like the ticking of a clock, and she could hardly keep from saying them out loud. Tweedledum and Tweedledee agreed to have a battle, for Tweedledum said Tweedledee had spoiled his nice new rattle. Just then flew down a monstrous crow, as black as a tar barrel, which frightened both the heroes so they quite forgot their quarrel. And here, of course, is Tennille's rather famous illustration of Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Let me see if I can get that to focus in. It doesn't like focusing on these things for some reason. I apologize. There we go. Tweedledum, Tweedledee, and Alice. I know what you're thinking about, said Tweedledum, but it isn't so, nohow. Contrariwise, continued Tweedledee, if it was so, it might be, and if it were so, it would be, but as it isn't, it ain't. That's logic. I was thinking, Alice said, very politely, which is the best way out of this wood? It's getting so dark. Would you tell me, please? But the fat little men only looked at each other and grinned. They looked so exactly like a couple of great schoolboys that Alice couldn't help pointing her finger at Tweedledum and saying, "First boy." "Nohow," Tweedledum cried out briskly, and shut his mouth up again with a snap. "Next boy," said Alice, passing on to Tweedledee, although she felt quite certain he would only shout out, "Contrariwise," and so he did. "You've begun wrong," cried Tweedledum. "The first thing in a visit is to say, 'How d'ye do?' and shake hands." And here the two brothers gave each other a hug, and then they held out the two hands that were free to shake hands with her. Alice did not like shaking hands with either of them at first, for fear of hurting the other one's feelings. So, as the best way out of the difficulty, she took hold of both hands at once. The next moment, they were dancing round in a ring. This seemed quite natural, she remembered afterwards, and she was not even surprised to hear music playing. It seemed to come from the tree under which they were dancing, and it was done, as well as she could make it out, by the branches rubbing one across the other like fiddles and fiddlesticks. "But it certainly was funny," Alice said afterwards when she was telling her sister the history of all this, "to find myself singing 'Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush.' I don't know when I began it, but somehow I felt as if I'd been singing it for a long, long time." The other two dancers were fat and very soon out of breath. "4 times round is enough for one dance," Tweedledum panted out, and they left off dancing as suddenly as they had begun. The music stopped at the same moment. Then they let go of Alice's hands and stood looking at her for a minute. There was a rather awkward pause, as Alice didn't know how to begin a conversation with people she had just been dancing with. It would never do to say, "How do you do now?" she said to herself. "We seem to have got beyond that somehow." "I hope you're not much tired," she said at last. "Nohow, and thank you very much for asking," said Tweedledum. "So much obliged," added Tweedledee. "You like poetry?" "Yes, well, pretty well. Some poetry," Alice said doubtfully. "Would you tell me which road leads out of the wood?" "What shall I repeat to her?" said Tweedledee, looking round at Tweedledum with great solemn eyes, and not noticing Alice's question. "The Walrus and the Carpenter is the longest," Tweedledum replied, giving his brother an affectionate hug. Tweedledee began instantly. "The sun was shining." Here Alice ventured to interrupt him. "If it's very long," she said as politely as she could, "would you please tell me first which road?" Tweedledee smiled gently and began again. "The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all his might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright, and this was odd because it was the middle of the night. The moon was shining sulkily because she thought the sun had got no business to be there after the day was done. 'It's very rude of him,' she said, 'to come and spoil the fun.' The sea was wet as wet could be. The sands were dry as dry. You could not see a cloud because no cloud was in the sky. No birds were flying overhead. There were no birds to fly. The Walrus and the Carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. 'If this were only cleared away,' they said, 'it would be grand.' 'If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, Do you suppose, the walrus said, that they could get it clear? I doubt it, said the carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. Oh, oysters, come and walk with us, the walrus did beseech. A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk along the briny beach. We cannot do with more than 4 to give a hand to each. The eldest oyster looked at him, but never a word he said. The eldest oyster winked his eye and shook his heavy head, meaning to say he did not choose to leave the oyster bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat. And this was very odd because, they hadn't any feet. 4 other oysters followed them, and yet another 4. And thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more, all hopping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The walrus and the carpenter walked on a mile or so, and then they rested on a rock, conveniently low, and all the little oysters stood and waited in a row. The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings. But wait a bit, the oysters cried, before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath and all of us are fat. No hurry, said the carpenter. They thanked him much for that. A loaf of bread, the walrus said, is what we chiefly need. Pepper and vinegar besides are very good indeed. Now, if you're ready, oysters dear, we can begin to feed. And, whoops. I wanted to show, where's a good picture? All right, here. There are the oysters, the walrus and the carpenter, and of course the oysters. Now, if you're ready, oysters dear, we can begin to feed. But not on us, the oysters cried, turning a little blue. After such kindness, that would be a dismal thing to do. The night is fine, the walrus said. Do you admire the view? It was so kind of you to come, and you are very nice. The carpenter said nothing but, cut us another slice. I wish you were not quite so deaf. I've had to ask you twice. It seems a shame, the walrus said, to play them such a trick, after we brought them out so far and made them trot so quick. The carpenter said nothing, but the butter is spread too thick. I weep for you, the walrus said. I deeply sympathize. With sobs and tears he sorted out those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. Oh, oysters, said the carpenter, you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again? But answer came there none, and this was scarcely odd, because they'd eaten every one. I like the walrus best, said Alice, because he was a little sorry for the poor oysters. He ate more than the carpenter, though, said Tweedledee. You see, he held his handkerchief in front so that the carpenter couldn't count how many he took, contrariwise. That was mean, Alice said indignantly. Then I like the carpenter best if he didn't eat so many as the walrus. But he ate as many as he could get, said Tweedledum. This was a puzzler. After a pause, Alice began, Well, they were both very unpleasant characters. Here she checked herself in some alarm at hearing something that sounded to her like the puffing of a large steam engine in the wood near them. though she feared it was much more likely to be a wild beast. "Are there any lions or tigers about here?" she asked timidly. "It's only the Red King. It's only the Red King snoring," said Tweedledee. "Come and look at him," the brothers cried, and they each took one of Alice's hands and led her up to where the king was sleeping. And that's where we're going to stop, because the Red King is a subject of much conversation and other things, and is also one of the, if the running as fast as you can just to stay in the same place is one of the most quoted parts of the book. Conceptually, the Red King and the dreams of the Red King are perhaps the most important conceptual bit in the book in terms of its lasting power in conversation and philosophy and various other things. The Red King's Dream. And in fact, now that I think of it, I think I actually titled one of the Otherland chapters Red King's Dream or something like that. Anyway, but we will come back to that tomorrow. Excuse me, later today, 7 p.m. Not tomorrow, although tomorrow in my sense, because I'll sleep between them. But yes, so that's it for tonight. I will be back at 7 o'clock to continue. We will at least briefly meet the Red King, although the Red King will only be there to be talked about, not to talk himself, because he's sleeping, which is important for all of us, but we'll talk about that tomorrow. Anyway, until that point, thank you again for joining me. It is always a pleasure to spend time with you. Thank you for your indulgence. I hope you take good care of yourselves and your special ones around you. Keep an eye out for others who might need a little kindness now and then too. We all could use a little kindness these days. It's a tough old world sometimes. Until I see you again, whether it be at 7 p.m. or if you're watching this on a recording on YouTube or on Facebook or somewhere, whenever I see you again next, or you see me, or one of us sees the other first and then avoids the other, however that might work out, I wish you peace and all good health, and I will talk to you real soon. Ciao.